January in Nanjing is a season of bone-chilling dampness. The kind of cold that doesn't just sit on your skin, but burrows deep into your marrow. In 1996, the city was a labyrinth of narrow alleys and burgeoning modernization, a place where history lived in the cracks of the pavement. At the heart of it was Nanjing University, a prestigious institution where dreams were supposed to take flight. But for one 19-year-old girl, the university gates would become the threshold of a nightmare that has haunted China for nearly 3 decades. Dao Aking was, by all accounts, an unremarkable girl. She wasn't the kind of person you'd notice in a crowded lecture hall. With short hair, thick glasses, and a quiet, studious demeanor, she was a first-year student from a humble rural background in Jiangsu province. She lived a life of routine, a plain Jane who kept her head down and her nose in her books. She was the pride of her family, the girl who had made it from the fields to the big city. The evening of January 10, 1996, began with a moment of mundane friction. Diao had been involved in a minor dispute with the dormitory manager. It was a petty squabble over an electric cooker, a common violation in student housing, but one that carried the weight of disciplinary shame for a girl like Diao. Feeling the sting of the reprimand and the suffocating atmosphere of the dorm, she decided to clear her head. Around 6:30 p.m., she pulled on her modest red coat and walked out of the dormitory. She didn't take her books. She didn't take her purse. She just stepped into the freezing twilight of Nanjing, disappearing into the mist of the evening commute. For 9 long days, there was nothing but a deafening silence. No sightings at the local markets, no frantic phone calls home, no traces left in the slush-covered streets. Her roommates waited, their initial annoyance at her absence turning into a cold, creeping dread. In the mid-90s, in a city of millions without the ubiquitous gaze of CCTV cameras, a person could simply evaporate into the gray skyline. Then came the morning of January 19th. A heavy summer Friday. Near Qingniandian Road, a sanitation worker was beginning her grueling shift in the winter gloom. She spotted a series of black plastic bags discarded near a trash bin. To a worker in a lean economy, the contents looked like discarded meat scraps from a local butcher. She picked up one of the bags and took it home, hoping to salvage something for a meal. But as she began to wash the contents in a basin of lukewarm water, the domestic scene shattered into a tableau of pure horror. Floating among the pieces of flesh were 3 distinct, human fingers. The police were called, and what they found in the subsequent hours would redefine the limits of human depravity. It wasn't just a body. It was a masterpiece of macabre precision. Spread across various locations in the city near the university, at the stadium, and in the dark corners of quiet residential streets were more bags. When the forensic teams at the Nanjing Municipal Bureau began the grim task of reassembly, they realized they weren't dealing with a typical crime of passion or a panic concealment. The victim, confirmed to be Diao Aking, had been meticulously dismembered. We aren't talking about a few jagged cuts. This was an act of surgical obsession. The body had been processed into more than 2,000 individual pieces. Each slice was uniform, each cut deliberate. The internal organs had been removed and arranged with a chilling, clinical neatness. The level of patience required to perform such a task is almost impossible to fathom. It would have taken hours, if not days, of steady-handed labor in total seclusion. As the investigators stared at the rows of neatly sliced tissue, a terrifying profile began to emerge. This wasn't the work of a monster who had lost control. This was the work of a man who was very much in control. A man who looked at a human being not as a person, but as a puzzle to be solved. And as the sun set over the crime scene, the police realized that somewhere in the crowded streets of Nanjing, a ghost was walking among them, a ghost who knew exactly how the human body worked, and exactly how to make it disappear. To understand the depth of this depravity, you have to understand who Diao Aking was before she became a cold case file. A 19-year-old freshman from a rural village, Diao was a girl who lived in the margins. She was described by her few acquaintances as simple, introverted, and incredibly ordinary, a girl who preferred the company of books to the chaos of college social life. In a city of millions, she was a whisper. But on the night of January 10, 1996, that whisper was silenced. It started with a petty dispute, a flicker of tension over a dormitory rule regarding a space heater. Dao, perhaps feeling the crushing weight of the city's isolation, stepped out into the biting January air to clear her head. She was last seen wearing a bright red coat, a lone splash of color against the gray, monolithic backdrop of the university district. She walked into the darkness, and for 9 days, the world moved on without her. The discovery of the bags wasn't a sudden explosion of horror, it was a slow, sickening realization. When the sanitation worker first pulled those heavy plastic bundles from the trash on a frigid morning, she initially thought she'd found discarded pork. But as the frost began to melt off the packages in the warmth of her workspace, the truth began to bleed through. The police weren't just looking at a body. They were looking at an anatomical atlas. 2,000 pieces. Let that number sink in. To reduce a human being to 2,000 uniform slices requires more than just a sharp knife. It requires an iron will and a staggering amount of time. This wasn't a panic killer in a basement. This was someone who worked with the clinical detachment of a scientist, someone who found a perverse piece in the rhythm of the blade. Each piece of tissue was roughly the same size, the skin handled with a delicacy that was almost tender. The internal organs were not merely dumped, they were cleaned and arranged with a terrifying, geometric precision that suggested the killer had all the time in the world. The forensic teams were paralyzed by the implications. Most dismemberment cases are about disposal, hacking a body into large, manageable chunks to hide the evidence. But this was an act of extreme overkill. This was a process. This was a craftsman at work. The silent witnesses, the heavy-duty plastic bags, and the specific way they were tied pointed to a predator who was intimately familiar with the urban geography of Nanjing. He knew exactly which alleys were unlit, which trash heaps were ignored, and exactly how to move through a crowded city while carrying the weight of a human life in his hands. The investigators were forced to confront a chilling psychological profile. This killer possessed a level of patience that was fundamentally inhuman. He didn't just want Dao dead, he wanted her erased, reorganized, and returned to the city in a way that mocked the very architecture of life. As the forensic pathologists painstakingly mapped out the remains, they noticed something that made their blood run cold. There were no jagged edges, no signs of hesitation, and no evidence of struggle on the pieces that could be identified. Just clean, decisive strokes. The investigation began to focus on those with a high degree of medical or butchery skill, men who could look at a person and see only a series of joints and fibers. But as they combed through the files of every surgeon, medical student, and slaughterhouse worker in the city, they realized they were hunting a ghost who was much more sophisticated than they had imagined. The killer hadn't just left the body behind. He had left a signature, a subtle, twisted hint that this wasn't just a murder, but a debut. And as the police analyzed the final bag found near the city center, they discovered a detail that changed everything: a small, deliberate omission that suggested the killer wasn't done with Dao Aking, or with the city of Nanjing, just yet. That omission wasn't an oversight. It was a choice. In the grim, fluorescent-lit hallways of the Nanjing Police Department, the investigators stared at the evidence with a sense of mounting dread. The bag found near the city center contained the most harrowing discovery yet: Dao Aking's head and her internal organs. But they weren't tossed aside like trash. They were handled with a level of clinical reverence that bordered on the religious. The medical examiners began the soul-crushing task of cataloging the remains. What they found would haunt their dreams for decades. This wasn't a crime of passion, a momentary lapse into madness, or a clumsy attempt at disposal. It was a masterpiece of butchery. They counted the pieces one by one, like a currency of the damned. When the final tally was made, the number stopped the hearts of every officer in the room: 2,115 pieces. Think about that number. Let it sink in. 2,115. Each fragment of Dao Aking had been sliced with surgical precision. The pieces were uniform, cut into small, neat cubes, almost like they were intended for a grotesque culinary display. The skin had been removed with the delicacy of someone filleting a rare fish. Even more chilling was the state of the flesh. The killer had boiled the remains. This wasn't just to destroy DNA, which was a nascent technology in 1996 China, but to prevent the scent of decomposition from wafting through the walls of wherever this nightmare had taken place. It was a practical solution to a logistical problem: how to spend days, perhaps even a week, meticulously deconstructing a human being without the neighbors catching a whiff of death. The omission the police had noted was the lack of any jagged edges. There were no signs of hacking, no frantic sawing, and no hesitation marks. Whoever did this possessed the steady hand of a seasoned professional. They knew exactly where the joints met, how the tendons connected to the bone, and how to slide a blade through the human anatomy as if it were soft butter. The profile of the killer began to shift from a random predator to something far more dangerous: a man with a background in medicine, anatomy, or perhaps high-end butchery. Someone who viewed Diao Aking not as a person, but as a project. As the detectives retraced Diao's final steps, they kept returning to that cold January evening. She had walked out of her dormitory after a minor, almost trivial argument with the building manager over an electric heater. It was the kind of mundane interaction that defines student life. But for Diao, that small spark of teenage rebellion led her straight into the maw of a monster. She had vanished into the biting wind of a Nanjing winter, leaving no trail, no screams, and no witnesses. The psychological profile emerging from the morgue was terrifying. This killer was a perfectionist. He was patient. He was comfortable with the intimate, wet work of dismemberment. He had spent hours, possibly days, in a private space, likely his own home, engaged in a labor-intensive ritual of violence. He wasn't hiding his crime, he was displaying his skill. By scattering the bags across the city, he was forcing the public to look at what he had done, piece by piece. He was turning the entire city of Nanjing into his gallery. But as the police expanded their search, looking for a man with a scalpel and a cold heart, they realized they were missing a crucial piece of the timeline. Between the moment Dao walked out of her dorm and the moment the first bag was found, there was a black hole of 9 days. 9 days where Diao Aking was somewhere with someone. The forensics suggested she hadn't died immediately, and as the investigators looked closer at the organs neatly arranged, almost tucked into the bags with care, they realized the most horrifying truth of all. The killer hadn't just been meticulous with her body. He had been intimate with her life. Because inside one of the bags, hidden beneath the neatly folded remains, they found a single object that didn't belong to Diao Aking, an object that suggested the killer had been watching her long before that cold January night, waiting for the perfect moment to invite her into his dark, private world. The object was a small, hand-drawn map of the university campus, with a faint red circle around the dormitory where Aking lived. It wasn't hers. It was a predator's blueprint. This discovery shifted the entire atmosphere of the investigation from a search for a missing person to the hunt for a calculated, obsessive stalker. The scale of the carnage was unlike anything the Nanjing police had ever witnessed. We're not talking about a messy crime scene or a body dumped in a moment of panic. This was a masterpiece of malice. When the forensic pathologists began the grim task of counting the remains, the numbers ceased to make sense. 100 pieces? No. 500? Keep going. By the time they finished the inventory, the final tally was staggering: over 2,000 individual pieces of human tissue. Think about the physical labor involved in that. This wasn't just a murder, it was an industrial process. The killer hadn't just used a knife, he had wielded it with the grace of a sculptor and the cold efficiency of a machine. Every piece was uniform, sliced into thin, delicate strips or small cubes, each approximately 3 centimeters in size. Even the internal organs were handled with a bizarre, ritualistic reverence. They weren't just discarded, they were cleaned and arranged with a level of anatomical precision that suggests the person behind the blade knew exactly where every nerve, every artery, and every bone began and ended. This brings us to the profile of a ghost. The police began scouring the city for someone with a background in medicine or professional butchery. But even for a seasoned surgeon, this task would have been exhausting. It would have required hours, possibly days, of undisturbed concentration. Imagine the scene: a quiet room, perhaps a hidden basement or a secluded kitchen, bathed in the harsh glow of a single bulb. The only sound is the rhythmic, wet thud of steel against a cutting board and the heavy, controlled breathing of a man who viewed Dao Aking not as a girl with dreams, but as a project to be completed. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He worked with a cold, mechanical detachment that points toward a high-functioning sociopath, someone who could spend 48 hours covered in the evidence of his depravity, then walk into a grocery store or a lecture hall without a single tremor in his hands. And then there was the heat. Forensic analysis revealed a detail that turns the stomach of even the most hardened investigators. Parts of the body had been boiled. Why? Was it a calculated move to destroy DNA evidence in an era when such technology was still in its infancy in China? Or was it something far more sinister? A way to purify the victim? Or perhaps a gruesome attempt to mimic the preparation of a meal? As the investigation widened, the police realized they weren't looking for a monster hiding in the shadows. They were looking for a neighbor, a colleague, a professional. They began a massive sweep of Nanjing, focusing on anyone who had access to large-scale refrigeration, professional-grade cutlery, or the specialized knowledge required to reduce a human being to 2,000 identical pieces. But as they combed through the medical schools and slaughterhouses, a chilling realization began to dawn on the task force. The most dangerous evidence wasn't the body parts themselves, but the locations where they were found. The bags had been dropped in high-traffic areas, near the university and busy intersections, almost as if the killer wanted them to be found. He wasn't just disposing of evidence, he was staging an exhibition. Just as the leads began to grow cold, a witness finally stepped forward with a memory that had been buried by fear. A student claimed to have seen Aking on the night she vanished. She wasn't being dragged away, and she wasn't screaming. She was standing at the edge of the campus, illuminated by a flickering street lamp, talking to a man whose face was obscured by the shadows of the winter fog, a man who was handing her a small, leather-bound book that looked exactly like a medical journal. That medical journal, the mere mention of it, sent a cold shiver through the investigative team. If the witness was right, Dao Aking hadn't been snatched from the sidewalk in a moment of chaotic violence. No, she had been invited into a nightmare under the guise of intellectual pursuit, or perhaps even a quiet, studious friendship. The leather-bound book acted as a Trojan horse, a bridge of trust between a shy girl from the countryside and a predator who wore the mask of a scholar. The image of that encounter, two figures shrouded in the Nanjing fog, the yellow glow of a dying street lamp reflecting off the damp pavement, became the focal point of the inquiry. Who was this man? In 1996, a medical journal wasn't something you'd find in every household. It suggested a specific social stratum: a doctor, a professor, or a high-level medical student. It suggested a person of authority, someone Dio might have felt compelled to listen to, or someone she admired. But as the police dove into the academic circles of Nanjing University, the forensic reports coming back from the morgue painted a picture that was far more disturbing than a simple abduction. We often hear the word dissection in true crime, but what happened to Dao Aking was something else entirely. It was a deconstruction. The medical examiners were faced with a task that defied human logic. Over 2,000 pieces of flesh, skin and bone had been recovered from those plastic bags. Let that number sink in. 2,000. This wasn't a frantic attempt to hide a body. If you want to hide a body, you bury it, or you weight it down in a river. You don't spend hours, possibly days, meticulously slicing it into thousands of uniform ribbons. The precision was haunting. Each piece was roughly the same size, cut with a steady hand and a razor-sharp blade. There were no jagged edges, no signs of hesitation, no evidence of the perpetrator struggling with the heavy work of butchery. It was as if the killer had treated Dao's body not as a human being, but as a complex anatomical puzzle that needed to be solved. And then there were the organs. When the investigators opened the bags containing her internal remains, they expected to find a mess of visceral horror. Instead, they found order. The organs had been removed with surgical expertise, and were arranged with a terrifying sense of neatness. It was a display of control so absolute that it hinted at a mind completely detached from the reality of suffering. This was someone who found peace in the rhythm of the blade. Someone who viewed the human form through a purely mechanical lens. The profile of the killer began to shift from a monster in the dark to something much more dangerous, a professional. Someone who walked among the elite of Nanjing during the day, perhaps wearing a white coat or a lecturer's suit, only to descend into a private, soundproofed hell at night. The police started canvassing the city's butchers and surgeons, looking for a man with the icy temperament required for such a task. They were looking for a man who could look at a living, breathing girl and see only a collection of parts to be organized. But as they scoured the hospitals and slaughterhouses, a new piece of evidence was pulled from one of the bags found near the university gates. It wasn't a body part. It wasn't a piece of clothing. It was a small, blood-stained scrap of paper, tucked deep inside a fold of skin, carrying a sequence of numbers that made no sense to the detectives. It was a code, and as they began to decipher it, the investigators realized that Diao Aking wasn't just a victim of a lone madman. She was the first subject in a twisted, clinical experiment that was far from over. The investigators in the winter of 1996 weren't just looking for a murderer. They were attempting to read the mind of a ghost. The scrap of paper found within the remains, that cryptic sequence of numbers, acted as a gateway into a psyche so organized it bordered on the supernatural. In the dimly lit precinct, the air thick with the smell of stale tobacco and desperation, the lead detective stared at the chalkboard. The numbers were circled in red, vibrating with a significance they couldn't yet grasp. They didn't correlate to any known address or telephone exchange in Nanjing. They were a signature, written in a language of cold, hard mathematics. Forensic pathology in the mid-90s was a grueling manual process. There were no high-speed DNA sequencers to do the heavy lifting. Instead, there were men in white coats, meticulously laying out over 2,000 pieces of human tissue like a macabre jigsaw puzzle. The sheer stamina required to perform such a task, the act of slicing flesh into uniform, bite-sized portions, suggested a perpetrator who viewed time not as a fleeting resource, but as a medium for their art. Each cut was clean, indicating a razor-sharp scalpel and a hand that never once trembled. This wasn't the work of a man hiding in a basement. It was the work of a professional who had mastered the silence of the operating theater. The profile that began to emerge was terrifying. The killer was someone who could blend into the crowd, a gray man who likely held a respected position in society, perhaps a doctor who spent his days saving lives, only to spend his nights meticulously deconstructing one. Or a butcher who viewed the human form as nothing more than biological material to be processed. The psychological profile suggested a severe form of obsessive-compulsive disorder, channeled into a lethal ritual. To this killer, Diao Aking wasn't a person. She was a canvas. He wasn't just disposing of a body, he was conducting a study in precision. As the investigation reached its 2-week mark, the pressure from the Ministry of Public Security became a physical weight. Every medical student, every surgeon, and every person with a history of anatomical interest in the Jiangsu province was put under the microscope. Thousands of citizens were questioned, their lives dissected as thoroughly as the victim. Yet, the silent witnesses, the plastic bags, the scraps of newspaper used for wrapping, offered no fingerprints, no stray hairs, no usable DNA. It was a forensic void. The killer had cleaned the evidence as thoroughly as he had rinsed the organs. But then, a break, or what looked like one. A young officer, scouring the missing person reports from the months prior, noticed a chilling pattern. Diao Aking wasn't the first student to have a conflict with authority before vanishing, but she was the only one who had been returned to the world in this fashion. The numbers on the scrap of paper weren't coordinates, and they weren't a phone number. As the detectives cross-referenced the sequence with the university's internal archives, they realized the numbers belonged to a filing system, one used exclusively in the restricted basement of the medical library. On the morning of the next search, a heavy, suffocating fog rolled over the Yangtze River, swallowing the city whole. When the police finally breached the heavy doors of that restricted archive, they didn't find a suspect. They found a room that had been scrubbed so clean it smelled of nothing but bleach and ozone. But on the central table sat a single, leather-bound ledger. Inside, written in the same precise, clinical hand found on the blood-stained scrap, was a list of names. Dao Aking's name was at the top, but it was the 20 names listed beneath hers that turned the investigators' blood to ice. They weren't names of victims. They were the names of the very detectives assigned to the case. The silence that followed this discovery wasn't just the absence of noise. It was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of that bleached white room. Imagine the sensation. You are the hunter, the one with the badge and the authority, standing in the heart of a monster's lair, only to realize the monster has been staring at the back of your head the entire time. The names weren't just scribbled. They were calligraphed with a chilling, rhythmic precision: rank, surname, and even personal badge numbers that hadn't been made public. It was a psychological gut punch that left the lead investigators questioning every shadow they had passed on the way in. The Nanjing police were used to dealing with the dregs of society: the impulsive, the desperate, the pathologically angry. But this was a different breed of darkness. This was a predator who treated murder like a masterclass in logistics and psychological warfare. Lead investigators sat in the precinct under the flicker of dying fluorescent lights, staring at the ledger as if it might speak. The handwriting was a silent witness to a mind that didn't just crave violence, but order. Forensic analysts noted that the ink was a specific brand of high-end permanent pigment, the kind typically favored by draftsmen or architects. It didn't bleed. It didn't fade. It was as indelible as the trauma they were uncovering. They circled back to the physical evidence, the only truth they could hold on to in a case that was becoming increasingly surreal. The 2,000 pieces of Dao Aking. Think about that number for a second. 2,000. It's not just a statistic, it's a testament to a level of patience that borders on the divine or the demonic. A standard autopsy takes a few hours. To reduce a human being to pieces the size of a thumb tip, with the anatomical precision of a surgeon, would take days of uninterrupted, focused labor. This told the profilers two things. First, the killer had a kill room, a sanctuary of slaughter, where time stood still, a place where the screams of the city were muffled by thick walls and a cold, calculating purpose. Second, they possessed a chilling level of detachment. While the city of Nanjing was spiraling into a collective panic, while thousands of officers were canvassing the streets and checking every butcher shop in the province, this individual was likely sitting in a quiet room, perhaps listening to the radio, methodically working through bone and sinew, as if they were carving a holiday roast. But who was Dao Aking to this person? To the world, she was a shy 19-year-old freshman, a girl who had barely begun to navigate the labyrinth of university life. She was the girl who had a minor, forgettable spat with her dorm manager over an electric heater, a common, petty friction of student life. To the killer, however, she was a canvas. As the task force dug deeper into the list, a terrifying pattern began to emerge. Each detective on that list had a connection to a specific precinct, and each of those precincts was located within a 2-mile radius of the various dump sites where the bags had been found. It was a map. The killer wasn't just disposing of remains, they were marking territory. They were tracing a circle around the heart of the investigation, mocking the thin blue line that was supposed to protect the public. Then, a break. Not from the ledger, but from a scrap of fabric found deep within one of the discarded bags, tucked inside a section of the victim's remains. It was a small circular patch, barely the size of a coin. It wasn't from Dao's clothing. When the forensic team cleaned away the grime and placed it under the microscope, the room went cold again. It was a commemorative pin from a very specific, very prestigious medical conference held in Nanjing just 3 months prior. The investigators realized then that they weren't looking for a butcher in a blood-stained apron or a desperate loner in a basement. They were looking for someone who wore a white coat, someone who was perhaps more respected and more educated than any of the men hunting him. And as they turned the final page of the ledger to see if there were any more names, they found a final entry, in fresh, shimmering ink. It wasn't a name. It was a date. And that date was tomorrow. Tomorrow. That single word, written in fresh, shimmering ink, turned the cold air of the investigation room into ice. It wasn't just a date, it was a promise. For months, the task force had been chasing a shadow, but the discovery of that ledger suggested something far more terrifying: the killer wasn't finished. They weren't just looking for a butcher in a blood-stained apron, or a desperate loner in a basement. They were looking for someone who wore a white coat. Someone who was perhaps more respected and more educated than any of the men hunting him. To understand the killer of Diao Aking, you have to stare directly into the abyss of his patience. This wasn't a crime of heat or impulse. It was a cold, calculated performance that required a level of focus that borders on the superhuman. The number 2000 has become the haunting refrain of this case. 2,000 pieces. Imagine the physical toll of that act. It is not just the strength required to dismember a human being. It is the mental fortitude to remain focused through 2,000 separate, deliberate cuts. Each one precise. Each one uniform. If you spent only 60 seconds on each piece, you are looking at over 33 hours of unrelenting, rhythmic labor. This suggests a workspace that was private, secure, and clinical. The killer didn't just have a knife, he had a sanctuary. He worked with the steady, rhythmic breathing of a man who felt entirely safe, perhaps even finding a dark, perverted sense of peace in the process. He wasn't rushing to dispose of the evidence before the sun came up. He was taking his time. The forensic analysis of the silent witnesses, the plastic bags found scattered across Nanjing, revealed a terrifying level of organization. The internal organs were not just discarded, they were arranged with a grotesque sense of order. The meat had been parboiled, a technique used to shrink the tissue and prevent the telltale leaks of decomposition. This was a man who understood biology, who understood the way a body breaks down, and who knew exactly how to delay the inevitable discovery. The psychological profile that emerged was that of a high-functioning sociopath, someone who could compartmentalize extreme brutality with the mundane tasks of everyday life. He was the kind of man who could spend all night meticulously deconstructing a human being, and then, the very next morning, sit down for breakfast with a newspaper, his hands scrubbed clean of any trace of his work. He likely had a routine, a favorite tea, and a neighbor who thought he was quiet but polite. As the years bled into decades, the shadow of the killer only grew longer. By the time 2016 arrived, the 20-year statute of limitations for most crimes in China was looming. In many cases, this would be the finish line, the moment a killer could finally stop looking over his shoulder and breathe a sigh of relief. But for the people of Nanjing, and for the Ministry of Public Security, the idea of Diao Aking's killer walking free was an intolerable thought. They took the extraordinary step of declaring the case exempt from the statute of limitations. The hunt would continue indefinitely. They turned back to the evidence locker, hoping that modern science could finally speak for a victim who had been silenced so long ago. They utilized advanced DNA phenotyping, trying to pull a face out of the microscopic debris left behind. But as they sifted through the original evidence, a cold realization began to dawn on the new team of investigators. It wasn't just about what was inside the bags, it was about the bags themselves. When they re-examined the specific industrial grade of the plastic used in the disposal, they discovered something that had been overlooked in the initial chaos of 1996. The bags weren't from a local market or a hardware store. They were specialized medical waste containers, the kind used exclusively in high-security research laboratories. And as they cross-referenced the serial numbers from that era, they realized the shipment hadn't been sent to a hospital. It had been delivered to a private residence, a residence that, in 1996, belonged to the lead forensic consultant on the original case. This revelation didn't just rattle the cold case unit, it shattered the very foundation of the investigation. The man they had once looked to for answers, the intellectual anchor who had guided the 1996 task force, was now the primary person of interest. He was the one who had stood over the autopsy table, pointing out the surgical precision of the cuts with a steady hand, perhaps even admiring his own handiwork, while the detectives around him struggled to keep their composure. In the world of criminal profiling, We often talk about the hidden in plain sight phenomenon. But this was something far more sinister. This was a wolf who hadn't just put on sheep's clothing, he had become the shepherd. The bags themselves were the smoking gun that had been silenced for decades. These weren't your standard issue heavy-duty liners found at a local hardware store. They were high-density polypropylene, specifically treated to withstand the searing heat of an autoclave, the pressurized steam chambers used to sterilize medical equipment and biohazardous waste. In 1996, the tracking systems for medical supplies in Nanjing were rudimentary, a paper trail easily diverted or erased by someone with the right clearance. But the serial numbers, etched in a faint, heat-resistant ink, told a story that the consultant thought had been buried by time. They traced back to a batch of specialized supplies that had been flagged as a shipping error and removed from the university's pathology department 3 days before Diao disappeared. The psychological profile of this individual, whom the new task force began to refer to as the architect, shifted from a random sadist to a methodical perfectionist. For him, the human body wasn't a vessel of life, but a complex biological puzzle to be solved. The precision of those 2,000 cuts, the way the organs were organized with a terrifying, rhythmic tidiness, spoke of a man who suffered from a profound obsession with order. This wasn't a crime of passion fueled by a sudden burst of rage. It was an exercise in absolute control. Every slice was a signature, a silent boast that he could deconstruct a human life and rearrange the pieces in a way that defied comprehension. He wasn't just killing. He was performing an anatomical ritual, one that required hours of undisturbed silence, and the kind of specialized tools only found in a laboratory setting. As the modern team dug deeper into the 1996 files, they began to see the gaps where the architect's influence was most visible. Witness reports that mentioned a man in a lab coat near the university gates had been discarded as unreliable. Leads regarding unauthorized use of the anatomy labs after hours were marked as clerical errors and never followed up. The investigation hadn't failed because the killer was a ghost. It had failed because the man leading the scientific hunt was the one holding the compass, and he was intentionally pointing it toward a dead end. But the most damning evidence didn't come from the old forensic reports. It came from a single, overlooked item found in the back of a storage locker that had remained sealed since the consultant's sudden retirement in the early 2000s. It was a simple, nondescript journal, bound in cracked black leather. When the detectives finally cut the seal and turned to the entries from mid-January 1996, they didn't find notes on the investigation. They found a series of sketches, precise, anatomical drawings of a girl's face, rendered with the delicate touch of an artist and the cold, unyielding eye of a butcher. And at the bottom of the final page, written in a steady, elegant hand, were the geographic coordinates for a location that had never appeared in any police report. A location that, according to the map, sat directly beneath the floorboards of the university's oldest, most secluded lecture hall. The air in that forgotten lecture hall was heavy with the scent of cedar and a century of dust. But as investigators pried back the heavy floorboards, the atmosphere shifted to something metallic and cold. The coordinates were precise. In the darkness beneath the foundation, they didn't find a body, but they found something perhaps more haunting, a shallow, meticulously carved altar in the dirt. Resting there, centered with mathematical perfection, was a single silver earring. It was Diao. It was the silent witness that bridged the gap between 1996 and the present day, a mocking breadcrumb left by a monster who clearly enjoyed the hunt. The sheer scale of the horror found in those trash bags across Nanjing defies the human imagination. 2,000 pieces. Let that number sink in. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a feat of surgical engineering. Each slice was uniform, each organ handled with a level of respect that bordered on the religious. Forensic experts back then noted that the killer didn't just disassemble her, he archived her. The heart, the lungs, the entrails, all were cleaned and arranged with a chilling, clinical grace. It speaks to a mind that finds peace in order, a person who could sit in a quiet room for 48 hours, the only sound the rhythmic snick of a blade against bone, without ever once losing their composure. This was a butcher who understood the poetry of anatomy. He was someone who could walk among us, perhaps even someone who saved lives by day, while he took them by night. The psychological profile suggests a man of high intelligence, likely in his late 20s or early 30s at the time, possessing an ironclad discipline. He wasn't a man who made mistakes. He didn't leave fingerprints, he left a signature written in flesh. He was the ghost in the machine of a burgeoning metropolis, a phantom who used the chaos of the city as his cloak. For decades, the Nanjing police moved through the city like a massive, wounded beast, searching every hospital, every slaughterhouse, and every dark corner. Thousands of men were catalogued, their lives picked apart by the fine-tooth comb of the state. But the killer remained a shadow. In 2016, a pivotal moment arrived. Under Chinese law, the statute of limitations for most crimes ends after 20 years. The city held its breath, fearing the killer would finally be free to step out of the darkness, legally untouchable. But the Ministry of Public Security issued a decree that sent a shiver through the criminal underworld. The investigation into the death of Diao Aiking would never end. There would be no sunset clause for this level of depravity. The files remain open. The DNA is still being compared against new databases, looking for a familial match that might finally unmask the ghost. But as we stand in the present day, the most terrifying reality is the one we see in the mirror of our own communities. The killer, if he is still alive, would be in his late 50s or 60s now. He is a man who has mastered the art of the mundane. He pays his taxes, he walks his dog, and he perhaps even smiles at his neighbors. He carries the memory of those 2,000 pieces like a secret treasure, hidden behind a mask of suburban normalcy. He is the ultimate architect of a nightmare that has no end. As the wind howls through the corridors of Nanjing University, it's easy to imagine Diao Aiking is still there, her spirit woven into the very bricks and mortar, waiting for the one thing that has eluded her for nearly 30 years: a name. Somewhere, in a quiet apartment or a crowded street, a man knows that name. And as he feels the weight of the eternal investigation pressing down on his shoulders, he knows that the police aren't just looking for a killer, they are waiting for him to make his final mistake. But until that day comes, the case remains a jagged, unfinished puzzle, with 2,000 pieces that will never truly fit back together.